The Apache war paint was still wet on Takota's face when he heard his grandfather's voice calling from beyond the grave. 3 sharp rifle shots echoed across the red canyon walls, followed by the unmistakable sound of a woman screaming in his ancestral tongue. 20 summers had passed since he'd last heard that particular cry, the sacred death song of his people, but some sounds burned themselves into a warrior's memory forever. His paint pony reared as Takota pulled the reins hard, his weathered hands gripping his Winchester rifle with the intensity of a man who had been waiting 2 decades for this exact moment. The scream came again, weaker this time but unmistakably alive, rising from the cottonwood grove where the white rancher had been digging like a man possessed. Takota's dark eyes narrowed as he watched the lone figure of Jake Morrison stumble backward from what appeared to be a freshly opened grave, his face pale as winter snow against the harsh Arizona sun. Something was terribly wrong with this picture. Dead women don't scream, and graves 20 years old don't suddenly start bleeding fresh earth. Without hesitation, Takota urged his horse down the steep canyon wall, his mind racing through possibilities that defied everything he understood about life and death. Behind him, the thunder of 200 horses began to build like an approaching storm. His warriors had been watching too, waiting in the shadows of the red rock formations, maintaining their vigil over sacred ground that had been stolen from them so long ago. They had seen the rancher's discovery, witnessed the impossible emergence of what should have been nothing but bones and dust. Jake Morrison's hands shook as he helped the Apache woman sit upright, her long silver-streaked hair cascading over shoulders that should have been nothing but skeleton by now. Her skin, though weathered and marked by time, showed the warm flush of living blood beneath its surface. Her eyes, deep brown and startlingly alert, focused on Jake's face with an intensity that made him question his own sanity. This woman was supposed to be dead. He had heard the stories, whispered around campfires and in saloon corners, about the Apache woman who had vanished during the Garrett massacre 20 years earlier. "My God," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing sound of approaching riders. "You're Ayanna. You're the woman from the stories. But that's impossible. You should be long dead." Ayanna's lips curved into what might have been a smile, though her eyes remained fixed on the northern ridge where dust clouds were beginning to appear. Her voice, when it came, carried the weight of 20 years of silence and the authority of someone who had looked death in the face and chosen to wait instead of surrender. "Death is not always what it appears to be, white man. Sometimes it is merely a door that opens both ways." The drumming started then, deep and rhythmic, echoing off the canyon walls like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Jake had heard Apache war drums before, during his younger days when conflicts between settlers and natives were still fresh wounds bleeding across the territory. But this sound was different, more organized, more purposeful. This wasn't the random beating of excited warriors working themselves into battle frenzy. This was ceremonial, coordinated, the sound of a people who had been planning something for a very long time. Ayanna struggled to her feet, her movements growing stronger with each passing moment, as if the desert air itself was restoring strength to her weathered frame. Her traditional Apache dress, somehow preserved despite 2 decades underground, rustled as she turned to face the approaching riders. The intricate beadwork caught the afternoon light, and Jake noticed details that shouldn't have survived burial in the harsh desert soil. The colors were too vibrant, the leather too supple, the silver ornaments too bright. How is any of this possible? Jake demanded, his practical rancher's mind rebelling against everything he was witnessing. People don't survive being buried alive for 20 years. Clothes don't preserve like that underground. And where did all these Apache warriors come from? The reservations are hundreds of miles from here. Ayanna's eyes never left the approaching dust clouds as she answered, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You ask the wrong questions, Jake Morrison. The question is not how I survived, but why I chose to return now, on this day, at this moment when you happen to be digging in precisely the right place." The first riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the blazing sky. Even at this distance, Jake could see they were armed and organized, their horses moving in formation rather than the chaotic charge he might have expected. These weren't random raiders or desperate renegades. These were disciplined warriors with a specific purpose, and their attention was focused entirely on the grove where he and Ayanna stood. "They're going to kill me," Jake said, the reality of his situation finally settling in. I'm a white man on Apache sacred ground with a woman who's supposed to be dead. They're going to assume I'm responsible for whatever happened here. Perhaps, Ayanna replied, though her tone suggested she knew more than she was revealing. Or perhaps they will listen to what I have to tell them about the men who really are responsible for the horrors of 20 years ago. Men who thought they had buried their crimes so deep that truth could never claw its way back to the surface. The riders were close enough now that Jake could make out individual faces, war paint, and weapons. At their head rode a young man who couldn't have been more than 30, his bearing suggesting leadership despite his youth. His face was painted in traditional Apache war patterns, but his eyes held an intelligence and control that spoke of careful planning rather than blind rage. This was not a man driven by simple vengeance, but someone executing a strategy that had been years in the making. Ayanna raised her hand in a gesture that seemed part greeting, part command. The lead rider responded by raising his own hand, bringing the entire war party to a halt just 50 yards from where Jake and Ayanna stood. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of horses breathing heavily and leather saddles creaking in the desert heat. "Grandmother," the young warrior called out in English, his voice carrying across the distance between them with surprising gentleness. "We have been waiting for your return, just as the prophecy foretold." The spirits whispered that this day would come when the sun reached its highest point on the 20th anniversary of the Great Betrayal. Ayanna nodded slowly, and Jake noticed tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Dakota, grandson of my heart if not my blood. You have grown into the warrior your grandfather always knew you would become. Are the others with you? The children who survived that terrible night?" "All who lived are here," Dakota replied, his hand moving to rest on the handle of a tomahawk that looked both ancient and deadly. "We are the sons and daughters of those who were murdered while they slept. We are the children who were scattered to the winds, the wives who were sold like cattle, the warriors who were hanged without trial. We have spent 20 years preparing for this moment." Jake felt his blood run cold as the implications of this conversation began to sink in. These weren't random Apache raiders seeking plunder or glory. These were the survivors and descendants of some specific atrocity, people who had been planning and preparing for 2 decades to address wrongs that had never been acknowledged, much less punished. "The gold," Ayanna said, her voice carrying a weight that made both Jake and Dakota lean forward to catch her words. "Did you ever find where Colonel Garrett hid the sacred gold he stole from the burial grounds? The gold that was supposed to fund his retirement in California after he finished exterminating every Apache in the territory?" Dakota's face darkened, and several of the warriors behind him began shifting restlessly in their saddles. "We found traces, grandmother. We followed the trail from the mission to the mining camps, from the mining camps to the banks in Tucson and Phoenix. But the final hiding place remained hidden, protected by secrets that died with the soldiers who helped Garrett carry out his plan." "Not all the soldiers died," Ayanna said quietly, her eyes moving to focus on Jake with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward. "One of them lived, prospered, built himself a ranch on stolen Apache land, and convinced himself that time had washed away the blood on his hands." Jake's world tilted as understanding crashed over him like a flash flood. "No. My father bought this land legally from the territorial government. He had papers, deeds, official documentation. Papers signed by Colonel Garrett himself," Ayanna continued relentlessly. "Papers that transferred ownership of sacred Apache burial grounds to the very man who had helped murder the families buried beneath them. Your father wasn't just a rancher, Jake Morrison. He was Sergeant Thomas Morrison, Garrett's right-hand man, the soldier who lit the fires that burned Apache children alive in their beds." The sound that escaped Jake's throat was somewhere between a gasp and a moan. Memories began flooding back, fragments of conversations overheard in childhood, his father's nightmares that had plagued the man until his death, the way Thomas Morrison had always avoided talking about his military service, the locked chest in the barn that Jake had never been allowed to open. "The chest," Jake whispered, understanding beginning to dawn like a terrible sunrise. "The locked chest in the barn. Father made me swear never to open it, said it contained documents that could destroy the family name." Dakota leaned forward in his saddle, his dark eyes fixed on Jake with laser intensity. "What kind of documents?" "I don't know," Jake admitted, his voice barely audible. "After he died, I respected his wishes. I never looked inside. It's been sitting there for 15 years, gathering dust and secrets. Ayanna and Dakota exchanged a look that carried 20 years of shared pain and determination. The proof we need is in that chest, Ayanna said with absolute certainty. The orders, the maps showing where the gold is buried, the lists of Apache families marked for extermination, the correspondence with government officials who profited from our suffering. And if I don't help you? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Then you die as your father should have died 20 years ago, Dakota replied without emotion. But if you help us expose the truth, if you help us recover what was stolen and bring justice to those who escaped it for too long, then perhaps the sins of the father need not be visited upon the son. The sun had moved noticeably across the sky during their conversation, and Jake realized that whatever decision he made in the next few minutes would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone involved in this impossible situation. 200 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, waiting for his answer. A woman who should have been dead 20 years ago stood beside him, her very existence proof that the world contained mysteries far deeper than anything he had ever imagined. There's something else, Ayanna said suddenly, her voice taking on an urgency that made everyone present lean forward. Colonel Garrett didn't die in California as the official records claim. He's still alive, still profiting from Apache gold, still protected by powerful men who helped him cover up his crimes. The silence that followed Ayanna's revelation about Colonel Garrett stretched across the desert like the shadow of a circling vulture. Jake's mind reeled as he tried to process the implications of what she had just told him. If Garrett was truly still alive after all these years, it meant that the man responsible for the massacre had been living freely while the Apache had spent 2 decades planning their justice. It also meant that Jake's entire understanding of his family's history had been built on lies that were about to come crashing down around him like a house of cards in a dust storm. Dakota dismounted from his paint pony with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, his moccasined feet touching the red earth without making a sound. The other warriors remained mounted but alert, their hands never straying far from their weapons as their leader approached Jake and Ayanna. Up close, Jake could see that Dakota's war paint wasn't random decoration but carefully applied symbols that told a story of loss, preparation, and impending justice. The young Apache's eyes held depths of pain that no man his age should have had to carry, yet they also blazed with a determination that made Jake understand why 200 warriors had followed him into what could easily become a suicide mission. "Grandmother," Dakota said, using the traditional term of respect for an elder woman, "tell me about Garrett. The spirits that guided your long sleep, did they show you where he hides now?" Ayanna's weathered face took on an expression of concentration, as if she were listening to voices that only she could hear. Her fingers moved to touch a small medicine bag that hung around her neck, its leather darkened by age and use. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone relaying information from a source beyond questioning. "The visions came to me in the darkness beneath the earth," she said slowly. "I saw him in a great house with white pillars, surrounded by men in fine clothes who call him senator now. He has grown fat on Apache gold and the blood money paid to him by those who wanted our lands cleared for their railroads and mining claims. He lives in a place called Santa Fe, protected by laws he helped write and judges he helped buy." Jake felt his knees weaken as another piece of his family's puzzle fell into place. His father had made several trips to Santa Fe over the years, always returning with money and always refusing to explain where it came from. Thomas Morrison had claimed he was selling horses to wealthy ranchers, but Jake had never seen him take any horses on those journeys. Now he understood that his father had been collecting payments for his silence, living off the profits of genocide while trying to convince himself and his son that he was nothing more than an honest rancher. "The chest," Jake said suddenly, his voice hoarse with the weight of understanding. "Father always went to the chest before those trips to Santa Fe. He'd take out papers, study them for hours, then lock everything away again. I thought they were just old army discharge documents." Dakota's hand moved to the handle of his knife, a gesture that seemed more reflexive than threatening. "Those papers contain the evidence we need to bring Garrett down, but they also contain something else. The location of the sacred burial cave where he hid the gold he stole from our dead ancestors. That cave is not just a hiding place, it is a holy site that your father helped Garrett desecrate with his greed." The implications of this statement hit Jake like a physical blow. Not only had his father participated in murder, but he had also helped violate the most sacred traditions of the Apache people. In the unforgiving moral landscape of the desert, some crimes went beyond personal guilt and became stains that could never be washed clean. Ayanna stepped closer to Jake, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of the man he truly was beneath the shock and horror. You have a choice to make, Jake Morrison. You can continue living the lie your father built for you, pretending that this ranch was earned through honest work, or you can help us expose the truth and try to make amends for crimes that cry out to the spirits for justice. And if I choose to help you? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Then we ride to your ranch, open that chest, and use what we find to hunt down Colonel Garrett and everyone else who profited from Apache suffering, Dakota replied. But understand this, white man. Once we open that chest, once we start down this path, there will be no turning back. Garrett has powerful friends, men who will kill to protect their secrets. You will become a target the moment you choose to stand with us. Jake looked around at the assembled warriors, taking in their painted faces, their traditional weapons, and their absolute stillness as they waited for his decision. These men had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, training and planning and passing down the stories of what had been done to their families. They weren't going to be deterred by the prospect of powerful enemies or dangerous consequences. They had already accepted that this mission might cost them their lives. There's something else you need to know, Jake said, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. My father wasn't the only soldier who settled in this area after the massacre. There were others, men who took Apache names as their own ranch brands, who built their fortunes on land grants that were supposed to compensate them for their military service. If we're going after Garrett, we might be stirring up a hornet's nest of men who have as much to lose as he does. Ayanna nodded grimly. The vision showed me this too. 5 men in total, scattered across the territory, all living under names that are not their true names, all protected by the same network of corruption that shields Garrett from justice. But they are not our primary concern today. Today we focus on the chest and what it can tell us about where Garrett hides the sacred gold. Dakota whistled sharply, a sound that carried clearly across the canyon. Immediately, 4 riders detached themselves from the main group and rode forward, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust as they approached. Jake recognized the tactical thinking behind this move. If they were going to Jake's ranch, Dakota wanted advanced scouts to ensure they weren't riding into a trap. My ranch hands, Jake said suddenly, realization dawning. There are 3 men working for me right now. They don't know anything about any of this, but if they see 200 Apache warriors riding onto the property, they will assume we have come to kill everyone and take what we can carry, Dakota finished. This is what happens when truth has been buried so deep that even innocent men cannot recognize justice when it comes calling. One of the scout riders, a lean Apache warrior with streaks of gray in his long black hair, rode up to Dakota and spoke rapidly in their native language. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the urgency in the man's voice was unmistakable. Dakota's expression grew troubled as he listened, and when the conversation ended, he turned to face Jake and Ayanna with obvious concern. What did he say? Jake asked, though he was already dreading the answer. Smoke signals from the north, Dakota replied grimly. Our lookouts have spotted a column of soldiers riding hard toward your ranch. They wear the blue uniforms of the territorial cavalry, and they are moving like men who know exactly where they are going and what they expect to find when they get there. The blood drained from Jake's face as he understood what this meant. Someone had been watching, someone had seen Ayanna's emergence from the grave, someone had reported the gathering of Apache warriors to the authorities. The carefully planned revelation of 20-year-old secrets was about to become a running battle across the Arizona desert. How many soldiers? Ayanna asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. 50, maybe 60, the scout replied in English. Led by an officer with silver hair who rides like he knows this country well. Ayanna and Dakota exchanged a look that carried volumes of unspoken communication. Captain Bradley, Ayanna said softly. Another of Garrett's men, another survivor of the original conspiracy. He must have been watching the burial site all these years, waiting for someone to disturb it. Jake felt trapped between forces that were moving far beyond his control. On one side stood 200 Apache warriors seeking justice for wrongs that had been buried for 20 years. On the other side rode territorial soldiers who were probably operating under orders to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose those same wrongs. In the middle stood Jake Morrison, a rancher who had woken up this morning thinking his biggest problem was deciding which cattle to sell at market. "We can't outrun cavalry horses carrying 2 riders," Dakota observed, glancing meaningfully at Jake and Ayanna. "And we can't fight them in open ground without giving them every advantage their training and equipment provides." "Then we don't run and we don't fight," Ayanna said with sudden authority. "We disappear." Jake stared at her in confusion. "Disappear? Where? This is open desert. There's nowhere to hide 200 riders and their horses." Ayanna's smile held secrets that went back generations. "You think like a white man, Jake Morrison. You see the desert as empty space between destinations. But this is Apache country, sacred country, and it holds secrets that your people never bothered to learn." She turned to address Dakota directly, speaking rapidly in Apache for several minutes. Jake watched as understanding dawned on the young warrior's face, followed quickly by what looked like amazement and deep respect. When the conversation ended, Dakota began issuing orders in his native language, and the entire war party began moving with purpose and coordination that spoke of extensive training. "What's happening?" Jake demanded as warriors began dismounting and leading their horses toward what appeared to be solid rock walls. "We are going to ground," Ayanna explained. "There are caves and passages throughout these canyons that have been used by my people for centuries. Some of them are large enough to hide horses and men, others connect to underground rivers that can carry a person many miles without leaving tracks on the surface." Jake watched in amazement as Apache warriors and their mounts began disappearing into what he had taken to be solid cliff faces. Upon closer inspection, he could see that what appeared to be natural rock formations were actually carefully concealed entrances to caves and tunnels. The camouflage was so perfect that he would never have noticed it if he hadn't been watching warriors vanish into apparently solid stone. "This is impossible," he muttered, his rational mind struggling to accept what he was witnessing. 20 years ago, you would have said it was impossible for a woman to survive burial in the desert, Ayanna reminded him. Today you helped dig her out of her grave. Perhaps it is time to expand your understanding of what is possible in this land. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Jake could now see dust clouds on the northern horizon that marked the advance of the cavalry column. Time was running out, and decisions had to be made quickly. Dakota reappeared at Jake's side, having supervised the concealment of most of his warriors. "The choice is yours, white man," Dakota said urgently. "Come with us into the hidden places of the earth, help us open your father's chest and find the truth about Colonel Garrett, and accept that your life will never be the same again. Or stay here, face the soldiers alone, and try to convince them that you had nothing to do with whatever they think happened in this place." Jake looked around at the canyon that had been his neighbor for years, seeing it with new eyes that recognized the secrets it had been keeping from him. The Apache had lived in this land for centuries before the first white settlers arrived, and they had obviously learned its mysteries in ways that went far deeper than simple geographical knowledge. If he stayed here alone to face the cavalry, he would almost certainly be arrested or shot as a dangerous witness to events that powerful men wanted to keep buried. "The chest is in the barn," Jake said, making his decision. "But I don't know how we're going to get to it with soldiers surrounding the ranch." Ayanna's weathered face showed the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her. "Leave that to us, Jake Morrison. We have been preparing for this day for 20 years, and we know every secret path, every hidden approach, every weakness in every building between here and your ranch. Your father may have thought he was building a fortress to protect his secrets, but he built it on Apache land, and we know its vulnerabilities better than he ever did." As if to emphasize her point, the last of the visible Apache warriors melted into the rock walls around them, leaving only Jake, Ayanna, and Dakota standing in the grove where this impossible day had begun. The approaching cavalry was close enough now that Jake could hear individual horses and the jingle of military harness. In minutes, they would arrive to find nothing but an empty grave and 3 people who shouldn't have been there. "Time to go," Dakota said, grasping Jake's arm and guiding him toward what looked like a solid rock wall. As they approached, Jake could finally see the carefully disguised entrance, a gap between two boulders that appeared to be nothing more than a shadow until viewed from exactly the right angle. "What about the soldiers?" Jake asked as they squeezed through the narrow opening into darkness that smelled of ancient stone and hidden water. "Let them search," Ayanna replied, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "They will find nothing but questions, and questions have a way of leading men into places they never intended to go."